Endurance Junkie Podcast, Episode 8. Hey Junkie, thank you for joining me for Episode 8 of the Endurance Junkie Podcast, the show where I will be interviewing some of the fastest, smartest and most inspiring people active in the endurance world today. Now today's guest is Paul Newsome, and he's a pretty knowledgeable swim coach who has won the British University Championships in triathlon. He swam the English Channel, he won the 2013 Manhattan Island Marathon Swim, and he's coached and worked with Olympic swimmers and triathletes all over the world. Now Paul is also the founder of Swim Smooth, which is a swim company based in Perth, Australia, where he develops a wide range of dedicated swim training sessions for all levels of swimmers and triathletes. Good morning, Paul. How are you doing?
Very good, Peter. Thanks. Great to be with you here.
Now, for those of us who don't know you, can you talk a bit about yourself and your sporting background, how you got into coaching and why you started Swim Smooth?
Yeah, sure, no problem. I guess I've been swimming my whole life since competitively since about the age of 7. I got into triathlon when I was around about 16 after having a fairly fearful start to open water swimming, to be perfectly honest with you. Even though I've been swimming competitively for a long time, the thought of getting into triathlon and swimming in the open water used to scare me quite a bit. Like I say, despite being a pretty strong swimmer, but it's been a journey which I've really enjoyed, and now I relish swimming in the open water. I've recently been, in the last 5 years, gravitated towards marathon swimming over triathlon events, primarily because of the busyness with both my family life. I've got 2 little kiddies, 5 and 2, and my wife, and also with the Swim Smooth business as well. So marathon swimming still allows me to keep a hand in the endurance sporting arena, but probably on around about 12 hours of training a week, as opposed to what I was doing with triathlon at around about 20-25 hours a week. I studied sports and exercise science at Bath University between 1997 and 2001, and was lucky to be selected as part of the world-class British triathlon world-class triathlon team. So I spent quite a bit of time down there and working on my triathlon. And yeah, so I guess I still have a massive love for triathlon, and I feel that I will one day gravitate back towards a sport myself, but at this stage in the game, I'm primarily just swimming, which is good.
Yep.
Yeah. So I guess, you mentioned about the coaching as well. Sorry, and I moved to Perth in 2002 and was looking for a job, freshly out of university, having done sports and exercise science, and decided to apply for a swim coaching position at the local triathlon squad. They only had 3 swim sessions per week, but I was interested in making a bit more of a living from it. So I expanded the club program, and I got my start as a coach in a paid capacity. It started off very, very small. I was literally earning $125 a week, as I remember, and working quite hard for that. Probably working just as hard then as I do now as a coach. But it's a passion of mine to be able to help other swimmers and other triathletes improve their own knowledge of the sport and their ability as they're going forward. So I now coach full time. I run 12 squad sessions per week and around about 6 or 8 one-to-one video analysis sessions per week as well. I'm also running swimsmooth.com, which is in itself is pretty much a full-time position with my partner Adam Young, who's based over in the UK.
Yeah, so that's basically a website where swimmers can go to and find lots of information about how to improve their swimming technique and stuff like that.
That's correct. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah, we have training plans and DVDs and videos and that sort of things to help you improve your knowledge of swimming, basically.
Yeah, awesome. One of the things you can probably find on that website is the 6 swim types that you use to help people improve. Can you tell us a bit more about those 6?
Yeah, absolutely. Swim types is an interesting thing which we've been developing for probably about the last 5 or 6 years or so. We officially released it in in June of 2010 when we ran our first Swim Smooth coach education program. The whole idea being that ever since I started coaching, I've been very much of the belief that we should coach swimmers and triathletes as individuals as opposed to just like a one fixed, one plan program for everybody, basically. And over the years and with experience, we've seen many, many different swimmers swimming with many different styles of stroke, etc. But we've actually been able to classify them into six very distinct swim types, as we call it. Starting off with the Arnie. We have an Arnie and a Bambino, and normally swimmers who are fairly new to swimming will be either one of those two swim types. An Arnie is somebody who fights the water, gets very frustrated with swimming. They're often very athletic people, but the biggest single stroke characteristic that is holding them back is low sinking legs in the water. So if you realise that you swim a lot faster with a pool buoy or a lot faster with a wetsuit, chances are you're probably a little bit of an Arnie or something from that. And like I mentioned, they're normally coming from quite a strong athletic background, albeit not in the water. A Bambino is also a very new swimmer. Bambino, as by the name stands, obviously means new. These swimmers are often a little bit more nervous and intimidated by being in the water. And the classic stroke correction that is required for their stroke is when they go to take a breath, literally the lead arm usually collapses down in the water whilst they go to take a breath to the side. So it makes breathing very, very difficult for the Bambino. And this is, the big concern which they always report to us that they need work on is the breathing and just feeling more relaxed in the water. We then move on to the kicktastic and the overglider. You'll realise I'm giving you these, Peter, in groups of two, basically, because if we were in a squad session and we had 3 lanes of ability, this is how these swim types would actually be clustered. We'd have the Arnies and the Bambinos typically in lane 1, the slower lane. In the middle lane, we'd probably have our kicktastics and overgliders. So the kicktastic is quite interesting in respect that they're almost the complete polar opposite of the Arnie with respect to things like pool buoys and wetsuits. These swimmers normally have very, very good body position in the water, and actually pool buoy or a wetsuit, they'll actually slow down. The pool buoy obviously takes away the propulsion that they're otherwise getting from their legs, and the wetsuit can often lift their legs too high out of the water, so they end up kicking thin air. We've been collaborating and working with the wetsuit manufacturer Hoob, who are based in the UK, and we designed their female Aura wetsuit specifically for the kicktastic. So the Aura wetsuit is basically a wetsuit for swimmers who don't like swimming in wetsuits, and that's almost seems, many people think surely everyone enjoys swimming in a wetsuit, but some swimmers don't, purely because their body profile is very, very strong in the water, and many of those swimmers are what we classify as kicktastic. Kicktastics don't necessarily have to have an amazingly good leg kick, but they tend to use it to propel themselves forward, even sometimes without realising that that lack of propulsion that they're getting from the catch and pull through is the main driver for relying upon the legs a little bit too much.
Is this something that's typical for female swimmers? Because you said you designed a female suit.
Say again, sorry, beg your pardon?
Is this something, the kicktastic, is this something specific to women? Because you said you designed the women's suit for Hoob? I'm thinking about kicktastics, the people that I see in the pool, a lot of them like that I think are women, or am I wrong?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, if for all of the swim types, there is a male and female version. We have the little fun cartoon illustrations, which maybe would sort of lend you to believe that the Arnie is classified with a picture of a strong-looking guy, and the Bambino is a female. But there is a male and female version of each one of these swim types. But the kicktastic, generally speaking, yes, a female. But the question you had there about good swimmers and buoyancy profiles, etc. Hoob wetsuits were the first to actually release 2 different buoyancy profiles. So a swimmer can select a wetsuit which is very, very buoyant in the legs and less buoyant in the upper body to lift the legs high in the water, but have a more of a neutral buoyancy. We have 4 millimeters in the chest and 4 millimeters in the leg, which is actually very, very beneficial for stronger swimmers who don't like to have the legs too high in the water as well. So yes, I mean there are male kicktastics out there. I coach quite a few myself, but generally speaking, the split would probably be 80% female to 20% male for the kicktastic. Um, Moving on, we then have the overglider. Now, I think it's fair to say that the world view of freestyle swim coaching in the last 20 years has always been about trying to make the stroke as long as is humanly possible and to try and take as few strokes as possible down the pool. And many coaching programs around the world sort of have their swimmers trying to take fewer strokes per lap. And the holy grail in the past has been around about 40 strokes per 50 meters. But what's quite interesting about that is the great Ian Thorpe, who many people sort of aspire to be within their swim strokes, he would take 32, when he was racing, he would take 32 strokes per 50 meters. And obviously that's a phenomenally long freestyle stroke. But what a lot of people failed to realise with Ian Thorpe's stroke was how fast his turnover was as well. So he had a stroke rate of around about 76 strokes per minute. And the two of those things in combination is what allowed him as a great champion to swim as fast as what he did. And in his recent autobiography, he talks about his stroke technique and mentions that he could, if he wanted to swim down the length in 20 strokes, not 32. But he recognised even himself that if he was taking as few strokes as that, he would simply be gliding down the pool rather than swimming efficiently. And that's quote for quote from Ian Thorpe, arguably one of the world's longest freestyle strokes. So the overglider, though, unfortunately, has taken this idea and almost overdone it, basically. We regularly see swimmers trying to take as few strokes as possible, but rather than having a stroke rate in the mid-range of around about, many age group athletes would have a mid-range of around about 54 to around about 70 strokes per minute. We see many overgliders down in the mid-30s. So they might have a very long stroke, but because it's such a slow stroke, it's a little bit riding your bicycle up a great big hill in a gear which is just simply too big for you. You're churning that very, very big gear. And unfortunately, in the water, with it being so dense, if you stall at the front end of the stroke and do like a catch-up style of stroke at the front, you're obviously going to decelerate and slow down. So even though taking fewer strokes per length sort of makes sense in theory that would be more efficient, unfortunately, because of the deceleration that occurs on the swimmer's body in the water when it's simply too slow, the swimmer is actually working a lot harder than what they truly believe they are. So the overglider, the way to actually correct the overglider stroke is to look at the stroke from underneath the water and work out where some of those dead spots are occurring within their stroke. And they usually, as the hand enters into the water, the swimmer extends forwards, but actually starts to usually reach back up towards the surface. And without being aware of it, the palm of the hand is actually showing forwards, creating a bit of a braking effect and slowing the swimmer down. So we correct that by a range of different drills which we've developed to try and tune it up. And it's not about saying to an overglider, you simply need to turn your arms over faster, because if they're still making that stroke fault at the front, it's going to feel like they're just driving down the freeway with their handbrake on. So it's like we've got to try and release that handbrake first with some stroke correction drills, and correspondingly the stroke rate will naturally come up a little bit higher. And we get some very, very good responses with that. A study of the people who are buying our swim type training guides from the website shows that the vast majority of swimmers who come to the website are overgliders seeking improvement with their swimming because they feel like they've plateaued off. And usually that plateau has occurred because they've taken the length of the stroke as far as they can take it, and sometimes too far. And unfortunately, it's affected the rhythm of their swim stroke. So these swimmers are usually very conscientious. They're very much into the theory, very analytical people, and that can really be a strength of theirs. In that they're going to be very diligent about what they need to do to try and improve, but sometimes they can take it too far and be just a little bit too overly analytical and overly too critical of themselves. And it's important that they obviously realise that they need to get in there and get the rhythm of the stroke going as much as trying to work on the length. And that then leads me to our two final swim types. The smooth is obviously fairly easy to talk about. If you think about Ian Thorpe and Grant Hackett, Michael Phelps, Rebecca Adlington, one of my favourite ever swimmers based in the UK, double Olympic gold medalist, they have a stroke which you look at and you just realise in an instant you can see, okay, that is an efficient freestyle swimmer. They have a long stroke but not too long. They have a classic high elbow recovery over the top of the water, good rotation, and everything just looks very easy, look very elegant in the water. So the smooth, you'd think to yourself, well, surely nothing needs to be improved with the smooth. But even Ian Thorpe mentions in various books which he's written or had written about him that he was obviously still refining his stroke all the time, albeit just very subtly. What's quite interesting about the smooth, though, in context to your question about triathlon swimming and endurance racing and those sort of things, is that smooth are great and they're very, very good in flat, still water, but sometimes they'll need to adapt and modify their stroke for the open water condition when it's quite rough and choppy. And a classic example of that was just last weekend in Stockholm at the ITU sprint race, World Series race. The other swim type that we have, of course, is what we call the swinger. And many of the world's best open water swimmers and triathletes are what we classify as swingers. They have a much straighter arm recovery, a much higher stroke rate, a slightly shorter stroke, which tends to suit swimmers of smaller stature, less broad shoulders, smaller hands, and those sort of things. Leading the water down there was Richard Varga and Henry Schumann, both Hoob athletes as well, led out of the water. And it was quite a choppy day in Stockholm. Right with them were the two Brownlee brothers, who we also sponsor through Hoob as well. And obviously they're fantastic swimmers and triathletes in their own right. But interestingly enough, Javier Gomez was having not such a great day. I believe he's actually a little bit sick. But the water conditions were very, very choppy, and Javier actually really excels in very, very flatter conditions. And the distinction between the Brownlee brothers and Henry Schumann, who's often commented on by the commentators as not having a very nice looking stroke, actually really excel in those rough, choppy conditions because they have a little bit more sort of rhythm and punch to their stroke. So the swinger is not necessarily as nice to look at, but in the right conditions, in the right environment, and for the right swimmer, that can really, really do very, very well for them. And quite a strong, profound distinction between swingers and smooths is that smooths like to often be in clear water, swimming at the front of the field by themselves, or maybe off to the side, whereas swingers have no problem with actually taking the benefit of the drafting of swimming behind some other swimmers. And we ran a very popular blog, one of our most popular blogs that we put out, and it said the title was "Behind Every Smooth is a Gaggle of Blood-Sucking Swingers." So the swingers aren't afraid to jump on the feet of the faster smooths sometimes, you know. So, yeah.
Awesome, thanks. It's a good explanation there, and I think a lot of people will be able to identify themselves with one of these 6 types. I guess they can go on the Swim Smooth website, and there's a little tool there to discover what swim type you are and what you can do to improve your stroke.
That's correct. Yeah, we've actually got a microsite, simply swimtypes.com. There's a couple of ways you can identify yourself. There's a little questionnaire, which we've got quite a sophisticated algorithm built in there to sort of show you statistically what percentage likelihood you are to be of each of those swim types. But obviously, it's tricky to make that as accurate as possible. So what we also show on the website is 4 video clips of each of the swim types, each of the classic swim types, basically. So you can sort of look at that, or maybe your coach can look at that and recognise yourself. And we also have like a reference sheet as well, which you can print off, and it has a couple of key points for each of the swim types. If you're fairly new to swimming, or if you haven't had too much sort of direct coaching feedback yourself, it's quite easy to classify within one of those swim types. But of course, if swimmers have received some good coaching over the years, they're probably it's not at all uncommon, for example, to see an Arnie who fights the water being told that they need to slow things down and lengthen out and actually become a little bit more overglider-like. So we do recognise like subtypes between swim types as well. But the whole idea behind the system is not to really pigeonhole people, but to show people how and where they need to start their stroke correction process, and to show them some of the classic things which might be holding them back, and get them moving forwards off their plateau, basically.
Yeah, great, thanks. Now, you've touched on it before, stroke length and stroke rate. Can you tell a bit more about that and go into a bit more detail and tell us how people can improve by just working on those 2 aspects of their stroke?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, fundamentally, what determines how fast you move through the water is a combination of those two things. So the length of the stroke and the rate of the stroke. The length of the stroke is very easy to measure because simply you need to know the length of the pool that you're swimming in. You push off the wall, and let's say, for example, you're swimming in a 50-meter pool. You push off, and you push off for 5 meters. So that pool length has suddenly gone from 50 down to 45, essentially. So if you took 45 strokes in that 45 meters, then you're taking a meter per stroke. So it's very, very easy for people to actually monitor that number. And historically, that's why people have monitored that, because it's an easy way to actually look at how many strokes you're taking per length. And like I say, unfortunately, there has been an idea that the lower the number without a boundary point, the lower the number, the more efficient. But obviously, if you've got somebody who's only 5'2", or let's say 155 centimeters or something like this, is that model of efficiency going to be the same for a person of 5'2" compared to somebody who's 6'6" or 6'8" with much broader shoulders, longer arms, and bigger hands, and those sort of things? So it's quite frustrating for smaller swimmers sometimes to be in a squad session where the coach says, right, we're going to do a stroke count set, and you've got to take less than 40 strokes per 50 meters. Now, obviously, somebody who's much taller has got a much easier chance of doing that than somebody who's a lot shorter and might never be able to get under 40. The swimmers who can't get under 40 often go away feeling quite dejected that they're not efficient swimmers. And yet, we had a classic example of a lady who's now been coaching with me for 5 years. A coach was banging that into her every single session, saying you need to take fewer strokes. And yet she was the fastest in the squad and was also the first out of the water at the World Long Course Triathlon Championships in 2009 here in Perth. So something about what she was doing must have been working, even though she could only take 50 strokes per 50 meters. And, people used to look at the great Janet Evans, swimming, a US athlete, and held the world 800 freestyle record up until very recently, beaten by Rebecca Adlington from the UK. She would take around about 50 strokes per 50 meters as well. So, if you're saying that less than 40 is efficient, and yet you've got one of the world's greatest freestyle swimmers of all time taking 50, the two don't tally up very well. Of course, what Janet Evans used to do was she used to swim at over 100 strokes per minute, which is an incredibly quick stroke rate. So that leads us on to the stroke rate thing, is that stroke rate is much, much harder to actually measure because you need somebody on the side of the pool counting how many strokes you take, let's say in a 15-second period, and multiplying by 4. So it requires somebody on the side of the pool to do that for you. The nice thing about stroke rate, though, is obviously that's a measure of the rhythm of the stroke. And if you are, like I mentioned beforehand, the last 5 years I've been doing marathon swimming events, and last year I was lucky enough to win, or fortunate enough to win the world's longest marathon swimming event around Manhattan Island in New York. It was 46k swim. My support crew had no idea. They couldn't tell me what the length of my stroke was, but they could easily measure the rate of my stroke. And the rate of my stroke around that long course swim was 81 strokes per minute. So that was my average rate. What they were looking for was if I dropped off by 5% or 10% or something like this, it would indicate that I may be getting a bit tired or hungry or fatiguing or what have you. So that was a good way for us to measure measure the consistency of what I'm doing. We don't know exactly what pace I'm holding, especially with the currents, etc., but we do know the consistency of my rhythm. So that's a good way to actually measure that. So the two things go hand in hand to deliver the swimmer's speed. And in terms of some actual numbers behind this, frequently swimmers in my squad would have a stroke count, so looking at the length of the stroke, of somewhere between 32 or 33 strokes per length in a 50-meter pool, up to around about 58 to 60 strokes per length. In terms of the rate, we'll typically see some of the overgliders being down in the low 30s, all the way up to Janet Evans, Laura Manadou from France. The Brownlee brothers are in the mid to high 90s strokes per minute. Laura Manadou would have been 110 strokes per minute. So there's a huge range that you can look at. And of course, when you watch the Tour de France, not everyone is riding the same gear up the same hill at the same cadence. It all depends upon the musculature of the athlete and how it sort of works for them, basically. So yeah, that's a little bit of about stroke rate and stroke length. And Finis, they're a swim product development company based over in California who we've done some work with, and we utilize a lot of their training gear. They have a thing called a tempo trainer, which allows a swimmer to input their stroke rate, and the beeper will just literally keep a consistent rhythm like a metronome. So you could plug in 60 strokes per minute or 64 strokes per minute, and it would just simply give a beep, 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 like so. And the swimmer has to make sure that each hand entry is entering into the water on that beep. So utilizing that, you can do, we've got up on the swimsmooth.com website, we've got a stroke rate ramp test where swimmers can start off at a very slow stroke rate, count how many strokes they're taking per 50 meters, look at how fast they're swimming each 50 meters, and just gradually per 50 meters increase the stroke rate by 3 strokes per minute, and see where a sweet spot starts to develop, where they're swimming with good length of stroke, with a good rate of stroke, and hitting some good times, but without taxing themselves too much. And that's quite a nice exercise for people of all different heights and abilities, and wingspans, as it were, to work out what is optimal for them at this point in time.
Yeah, awesome. I bought one of those Finis tempo drill tools last year, and it really improved my swimming immensely. So that's definitely something that's worth considering to purchase.
Absolutely.
Now, drills are also an important part of every swim training. In your sessions, do you have like a more or less fixed amount of drills you put in there, or does it depend on the swimmer and what he or she is training for?
Yeah, it's a very that's a very good question. First and foremost, I mentioned earlier on we have 12 squad sessions per week. Each of those squad sessions has a specific focus. So one might be a technique development session, one might be a hard endurance session for Ironman athletes, for example. We obviously encourage the swimmers to come to a variety of those sessions. And typically our swimmers attend maybe 3 or 4 sessions per week. So they get a nice blend of technique, some threshold development, some endurance work, some open water skills. And each one of those sessions, like I mentioned, has a different blend between what we call our 3 keys. So the 3 keys being technique being one of them, or drills, if you like. Specific fitness being the second key, and then open water specific adaptation to the open water being the third key, basically. So we have a different blend of those 3 things in each session. In terms of how many drills that we do, well, in our technique sessions on a Monday morning, which is like a nice easy start to the week, the technique sessions feature a lot of drills. And just to give you a couple of examples of what we might do, one of the nicest drill sequences, which we just developed fairly recently, is to do some side kicking, which is, it's not a drill unique to Swim Smooth, and it's been around for a long, long time. But we give the swimmer a pair of flippers just to give a gentle bit of propulsion, so the swimmer can think about what's happening up at the front end of the stroke. The swimmer will kick on their side. They'll have, for example, the right arm rested down by the side, the left arm extended out in front. They'll be looking down at the bottom of the pool, just blowing a long stream of bubbles. Now, historically, this drill has been used to either develop the leg kick of the swimmer or to develop their rotation in the stroke. What we like to do it for is to actually think about the posture in the water. So many swimmers, one of the biggest strokes faults we see on a daily basis, Peter, is people crossing over in front of their head. It's a very common thing to see. Yeah, exactly right. So this side kicking exercise, if you were to think about literally kicking on the side, drawing the shoulder blades together and back, so almost like you're having to sit tall in your chair, shoulders back, chest forward, stop that lead arm crossing over. So what the swimmer then does is they can do 25 meters kicking on one side, 25 on the other, just to think about that posture. But then we take it a stage further with our javelin drill sequence, where we give the swimmer a single paddle to wear. It's a Finis freestyler paddle. So this paddle is designed like an arrowhead with a single strap for the middle finger. It's a very technically challenging paddle to work with, because the whole idea is that if you cross over in front of the head, the paddle is designed to actually fall off your hand. So the swimmer then does the same drill. They kick on the side for 25 meters with the paddle on the lead hand, and then they get to the halfway, and then they start to swim freestyle to the end, normal stroke freestyle with just one paddle on, but only breathing away from the paddle. And the idea being that most swimmers will cross over in front of their head when they go to take a breath more than any other time within the stroke. So the idea is that the paddle is on at that specific point, so that when they're breathing away from the paddle, they're actually reminded about whether or not they're crossing over. And that's quite a common drill that we do within the squad, as is sculling. So we do a lot of sculling within the squad as well to generate people talk about improving their swimming by reducing drag, and that's obviously a major component of improving your swimming technical ability, especially for Arnie swimmers, for example, with low sinking legs. But a very important consideration, which again has historically has been a little bit overlooked, is how to actually generate effective forward propulsion. And sculling is a great drill for that. So the swimmer would swim with a pull buoy between the legs, have their arms extended out in front of them, and they'd just be gently sculling their hands in and out. And the key thing with this is it should feel like you're actually mixing water, hot and cold water together. And the key thing is to try and keep the fingertips slightly below the wrist and the wrist slightly below the elbow, a little bit like you're leaning over one of those big Swiss balls in the gym. The idea being there that it builds up your feel for the water in front of the head, and when the swimmer then goes into the freestyle stroke, they can focus on reaching into the water, tipping the fingertips down just slightly to engage the catch, and then start to press the water back behind them. And you're not looking for a big amount of force on the water. You just want to be making sure you're moving water in the right direction, i.e. behind you, to send you forwards. This is a great drill for any overgliders out there, especially because normally overgliders, when they reach forward, they present the palm of the hand forwards rather than back behind them, even if it's just for a short period of time. So by doing this drill, they can work out how to generate the best forward propulsion, so that when they go into the stroke, they can still lengthen forwards, but just not reach up towards the surface. And we pretty much do that in every single session that we do in Perth. It's a great drill to just warm up before a main set of a harder swim session, for example.
Yeah, and then that's basically you do most of the time your drills. It's that technique session on Monday, and then on the other sessions you just have a couple of reminders in there, a couple of small drills. But then you focus on more on fitness or on speed or.
That's exactly right. Yeah, if we do a 3K session, let's say on a Monday, which is most of that will be comprised of drills, to some extent, it might even be as much as 80% drills and only 20% normal freestyle swimming. Whereas a threshold development session might be 30% drills and 70% hard swimming. A Wednesday morning session, where we go through our Wednesday morning sessions become quite notorious here in Perth, and even on the Twitter and social media, it's a thing which we call the Red Mist session, and that's pretty much comprised entirely of just normal freestyle swimming and no drilling at all. And it's designed to ready an athlete for a half Ironman, or specifically an Ironman distance event. It's a very hard swim, longer intervals with very, very short recoveries, which we utilise the tempo trainer, as I'll talk to you about in a moment, to control that a little bit more. But we very rarely do any drills at all in that particular session. So it's almost completely comprised of normal freestyle. There'll be a little bit at the end just to cool down, and maybe a bit of a recovery set in there somewhere. But it's a pretty hard session. And in an ideal world, if we had, let's say, 100 swimmers, every one of those 100 swimmers would attend one of each of those 3 sessions to try and get the best blend possible. So I think in the past people have either focused on just fitness or just technique. What we're trying to do is we try and keep a very balanced program in Perth, where we try to ensure that people are doing all 3 of these things, the technique, the fitness, the open water skills, year round, as opposed to sort of periodizing that too much.
Yeah. Do you have your swimmers do any gym work?
That's a good question, actually. Gym work. I coach a variety of swimmers and triathletes. Some of them are professional athletes, as in professional triathletes competing on the world circuit, but the majority of people I coach are full-time employment with young families, etc. They're often restricted by the amount of time that they have available to train. Many of whom probably only have maybe 6 to 8 hours a week maximum to be able to do the sport that they love. And my opinion on that is that I think gym work is great, especially if it's very specific. My wife's actually a physiotherapist and Pilates instructor, and she's very much into core strengthening exercises and stuff. And I think that stuff is very, very important indeed. But if you're quite time poor and time strapped and only able to train 6 to 8 hours a week, it doesn't really make sense to 2 or 3 hours of that gym work, and the other 3 or 4 hours of the week the actual sport that you're trying to compete in. There are many things that you can do in the pool, for example. I've just mentioned there the sidekick or the javelin drill exercise, where you're thinking about drawing the shoulder blades together and back. That's very similar to an exercise that you might do in the gym, such as seated upright rowing or lat pull down, obviously without the weight, but it's still thinking about engaging and the right muscles in the right way to ensure that you're functionally putting that across into your swim stroke. If for the athletes that I coach who are full time, then of course, yes, they do spend quite a bit of time in the gym, developing their core strength and their posture, basically to be a much more rounded athlete. And I know myself, when I was training full time at Bath University, we would have regularly 3 gym sessions per week. And if I was back to full time training, then I'd definitely incorporate that myself. When I trained up for Manhattan to win this big race last year, I just didn't have any time at all for gym work. As much as I'd like to have done it, I just didn't have the time for it. But I managed to get through it and win this particular event on 10 to 12 hours of training per week. And I just wanted to maximise the time spent training as best I possibly could. And like I say, having a physio on hand is quite a fortunate thing. Should be able to sort of just keep my shoulders and mobile with a massage every now and again, etc. But otherwise, I was very much focused on purely the swimming and getting the distance in that I needed to do.
Oh, great. Let's talk a bit about the Olympic distance and Ironman swimming, because in swimming technical terms, like both can be described as a long distance swim. But I'm guessing that you train these athletes differently. I guess, if you want to be competitive in Olympic distance, you need the speed to follow the leaders. But in Ironman, it's more about getting to the bike with the least amount of energy spent. How would you train these athletes for these 2 distances?
Again, that's a great question. Essentially, any distance over 400 meters starts to really rely very much upon the aerobic system. So swimmers need to generally be as aerobically efficient as they possibly can be, and one of the ways we measure that is by looking at a swimmer's what we call critical swim speed, or CSS. This is not a system which we've developed, but it's one that we've wholly embraced within our program for about the last seven or 8 years. The idea being here, rather than actually doing a lactate analysis where you take bloods and monitor blood lactate accumulation, which can be very invasive and also quite costly, the swimmer can simply do a 400-meter time trial and a 200-meter time trial. The 400-meter time trial starts to look at how aerobically efficient they are, and the 200-meter time trial looks at how anaerobically efficient they are. That test used to be done as a 400 and a 50 historically, but recent research has moved a little bit more towards the 400 and 200 as being a more accurate way to determine somebody's threshold. So threshold in swimming is sort of described as what you'd be able to maintain for 1,500 meters. Some very, very fit open water swimmers who compete on the 10K circuit are able to hold very, very close to that pace for around about 5 kilometers as opposed to 1,500 meters, but they're supremely fit, these athletes. For the majority of us, it's what we can maintain for 1,500 meters. So if you're wanting to work that out for yourself, you go on our website, swimsmooth.com. /training, you can actually input your 400-meter time trial and your 200-meter time trial. Those 2 times need to be taken on the same day in the pool from a push, and it works out your threshold pace. So talking about whether or not you're competing for 1,500 meters or 3.8 Ks, it still benefits all of those athletes to get that threshold pace down as best they possibly can. So that's ubiquitous across all of the athletes I'm coaching. I want to know exactly what that number is for any athlete at any given point in time, and I'm trying to get that number down as best as I possibly can. Where the difference in sessions come in, though, is a slight difference in focus. So, for example, every Friday morning we run a CSS threshold development session. It's a very, very hard session. It's a classic example might be something like 10 times 200 meters at threshold pace. So from doing the 400 and 200, you work out that your threshold pace, let's say, is 1 minute 30 per 100. On a Friday, you do 10 times 200 meters at a pace of 130 per 100, or hitting 3 minutes per 200 meters. with, let's say, 15 to 20 seconds rest between each one. We can utilize the tempo trainer in mode 1 to actually accurately gauge that pace for somebody. So 130 per 100 meters is exactly 22.5 seconds per 25 meters. So by putting the tempo trainer and setting it to 22.50 seconds, the swimmer can actually make sure that they set off on a beep, and they're going through the 25-meter marker on the next beep, the 50-meter marker on the next beep, and so on and so forth. So they're able to develop their pacing awareness and ensuring that they're staying at exactly threshold pace. The nice thing about that is that because the tempo trainer is precise to 1/100th of a second accuracy, the next week they can just take off literally a tenth of a second. And because it's such a small rate of improvement, the athlete is likely to not be able to even feel or distinguish that on a week-to-week basis. But by doing that steadily and surely over a period of, let's say, 8 to 10 weeks, we start to get some really good improvements. So that session is very well suited specifically for Olympic distance athletes who are trying to get their 1500 meter time down as best they possibly can. And we may incorporate something a little bit shorter and a little bit faster than that as well to help them maybe at the start of the race when they're getting off to a slightly faster start and trying to benefit from drafting and staying with other swimmers a little bit faster themselves. Swimmers need to be aware that at the start of any open water event that they don't want to go off too fast, and that's why these tempo trainers come in really good, is that you have a threshold pace, whether or not you're racing or if you're in a training session. And a lot of people almost forget about that when they get into the race. They set off too quick, they put themselves way too much into the red, and then they slow down quite significantly. So even though I'm saying that the Olympic distance athlete needs a little bit of oomph and a little bit of speed, they still need to be able to control that. Now, on a Wednesday morning, we run this very specific, it's usually 4.5 to 5 kilometers, so it's a little bit over distance. And that's very, very popular with the local Ironman athletes. And we have some very good athletes here in Perth. Kate Bevilacqua is somebody I've been coaching for about 4 or 5 years now, and she's won 3 Ironman events around the world, and she's taken her 3.8k time, believe it or not, from 1:04.50 down to 49 minutes and 33 seconds when she won Ironman Louisville last year. So that's an improvement of nearly 16 minutes over 3.8ks. And the secret to a lot of that is making sure that she's doing the right stroke for herself. She's a very, very short athlete. She would take 58 to 59 strokes per 50 meters and yet be able to swim 49 minutes for 3.8K. So she's obviously doing something efficiently. But to really focus on these type of sessions. So I'm actually just looking at one right now, which I posted on Twitter yesterday. So this session went something like this. It was 4.5Ks, and we started off with 5 300s, and then 1 1,500 meter swim, then 5 200s, and then 5 100s. Now, the idea behind this is this particular session on Wednesday morning doesn't have a warm-up per se. And a lot of swimmers sort of moan and whinge about that. One guy yesterday said, I hate this, my arms feel like lead, I feel like horrible and stuff like that. I said, how much do you honestly warm up before an Ironman event? He said, well, I don't, I just put my wetsuit on, the gun goes and I start. I said, that's why we're doing this session like this. So it sort of teaches, the idea of the Wednesday morning session is not to be crazy and negligent to an athlete's welfare, but to ensure that they're properly prepared for the event when they actually go down to an Ironman event. So it allows them to get into the water. They're not setting off like a bat out of hell, but they're setting off without a warm up per se, and actually getting into a reasonable rhythm and just learning how to cope with that, not just physically but also psychologically as well. How many times have we started a race where we've set off, gone off too quick, or we haven't felt that great, and it's sort of negatively affected our mood during the event? The idea of this session, we jokingly call it red mist, because a lot of people during the session just rip their goggles off and just sort of say, I can't do this, I don't want to do this. But it's the athletes who sort of control that, and Kate Bevilacqua is somebody who's incredibly good at doing that. She never whinges, never moans, never complains. She just gets in and does it. That type of athlete is likely to be able to hold a very level head during a race. So that's what we're trying to do. This particular session, the way it varies to the CSS type session, the swimmers are being given a very specific target pace to hold. So using the previous example of 130 per 100, the swimmer's been given that 130 per 100. They must hold that. They must take precisely 15 seconds rest, and so on and so forth. On the Wednesday morning, we actually run on a cycle time. So the swimmer is usually given a tempo trainer in mode 2, and mode 2 is not as precise as mode 1 in that the increments are 1 full second increments basically, and I actually factor in a buffer per 50 meters where the swimmer, rather than having to stay with the beeper, they have to actually beat the beeper. So for example, that same swimmer who's got a threshold pace of 130 per 100 or 45 seconds per 50 meters, they might have the beeper set to beep every 50 seconds. And all they have to do is each 50, they have to be slightly in front of the beeper. However much in front of the beeper is very much dependent on how they're feeling on the day. So it's a little bit more flexible. It's not a very precise pace, but the idea being that over these longer intervals, let's say the 5-300s as we started off yesterday, they'd build up a bank of recovery of, let's say, 12 or 15 seconds before starting the next interval. So they're a little bit more responsible for not going off too fast, and but equally going off fast enough to ensure that they get some rest between each interval. So if you looked at the actual pace which these swimmers are swimming at, for these sessions on a Wednesday morning, relative to their threshold pace, it'd typically be in the ballpark of around about 3 to 4 or even 5 seconds per 100 meters slower than their threshold pace, than what we've identified for the Friday session, basically. But it's not, like I say, it's not as precise. I don't say you must hold this pace. If they're having a good day, by all means, I want them to sort of excel a little bit and see what they can do, see what they can push themselves along to. And equally, I want them to experience blowing up if they're going to blow up by pushing maybe a little bit too hard. So it's very much a session of discovery, if you like, that one. Not just about their physical attributes, but also about their mental aptitude as well. And it's a great session. We haven't published any of these sessions formally, but we'll be doing so with a new training plan that we'll be releasing fairly soon for Ironman athletes. So I'm quite excited about that one.
Oh, awesome. Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have today. Just quickly, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so we have so our main website, swimsmooth.com, is the area where you can pick up all the tips and techniques and a lot of the material. In fact, the vast majority of that material is free articles and stuff, so you can go on there. We do have DVDs and videos and waterproof training plans for Ironman athletes, half Ironman athletes, sprint distance, Olympic distance athletes as well on there. We run a blog every week, which now we believe is the world's largest subscriber base. We have over 100,000 subscribers from around the world who tune into that each week and receive an email from us every Friday afternoon. In Europe, it'd probably arrive in your inbox at around about 1 or 2 p.m. That's at the website or URL feelforthewater.com. And so each week we just pick a tip that we'd like to work on. So, we might be giving advice on some open water skills, some drafting that you can practice, or a new drill that we've come up with. So that's a good way of doing that. You can certainly follow me on Twitter. I'm at SwimSmoothPaul. And we also have a Facebook, SwimSmooth Facebook page as well that people can follow there. So that's the best way of getting in touch and just learning a little bit more about what we do with SwimSmooth.
Yeah, awesome. I'll make sure to add all those in the show notes. Well, thanks a lot for your time, Paul. And let's do this again soon.
That's great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for having me on.